What happens when civility ends on live TV? What happens when a duchess expecting an easy interview sits across from one of television's most ruthless interviewers? What happens when a polished PR persona meets a host who refuses to play along? It was a typical Friday night taping of Real Time with Bill Maher. The studio buzzed with excitement as fans took their seats, laughing at the warm-up comics' last few jokes. The city skyline twinkled through the large windows behind Bill's iconic desk. Producers whispered last-minute cues into their earpieces, while stagehands adjusted lights that gleamed against the dark wood backdrop. Backstage, Meghan Markle sat in the makeup chair, flawless as ever. She wore an elegant black pantsuit, gold jewelry catching the studio lights, her hair styled in soft waves. Smiling at her reflection, she rehearsed the same lines she had perfected over years of interviews. Lines about empowerment, purpose, and authenticity. This was supposed to be another easy PR win. At exactly 8 p.m., cameras rolled. Bill Maher strode onto the stage to roaring applause, delivering his trademark monologue, biting political jokes, a few digs at celebrities, the kind of edgy humor that made his show famous. And now, Bill grinned at the camera. Please welcome Meghan Markle. The audience erupted as Meghan walked out gracefully, her smile perfectly calibrated, not too forced, not too casual. She shook Bill's hand, exchanged pleasantries, and settled into the chair across from him. Meghan, Bill began warmly, it's not every day we get royalty in this studio. How's life after the castle? Meghan chuckled softly. Well, Bill, I wouldn't exactly call it a castle, she replied, voice smooth. But life is full, meaningful, purposeful. The audience laughed lightly, and for a moment it felt like any other late-night interview. But then Bill leaned back, his grin just a little too sharp. So, let's talk about that purpose. You've left the UK, left the royal family, but you're still in the headlines more than ever. Netflix, Spotify, interviews, books. Do you ever miss palace life? Or is this the life you always wanted? Meghan's smile flickered just for a fraction of a second. I think it's important to move forward, she said coolly. Harry and I chose meaningful work over meaningless titles. Sure, Bill replied, smirk tightening. But there's a big difference between giving up titles and signing Hollywood contracts. Do you think you traded one spotlight for another? There was a pause, a beat too long. Meghan tilted her head slightly, smile still in place but her eyes hardening. I think people are entitled to define their own lives, Bill, she replied sweetly. Not everyone feels satisfied playing by outdated rules. The audience chuckled nervously. Something in Bill's expression shifted. He smelled blood in the water. This wasn't going to be another friendly, forgettable interview. This was about to become a fight. The laughter from Meghan's carefully worded response faded quickly, replaced by a tension that everyone in the studio could feel. Bill leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, his smirk widening just a little too much. See, Meghan, that's what fascinates people, Bill said, his voice casual but cutting. You left the royal family, you say you moved on, but you're still everywhere. Netflix deals, Spotify podcasts, interviews like this. Do you think you actually stepped out of the spotlight or just built a new one? Meghan's smile held, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Bill, I think we both know that using your voice, standing up for what you believe in, and helping others isn't the same as chasing fame. Sure, Bill said with a half laugh. But the funny thing about fame is it's a lot easier to be purpose-driven when there's a camera in front of you and a big check attached. The audience gave an awkward laugh, half in amusement, half in disbelief. Meghan tilted her head, her tone still syrupy smooth. It's interesting you frame it that way, Bill. I guess cynicism is just your brand, isn't it? The jab landed. The audience let out a few surprise oohs. Bill's grin faltered for just a moment, then returned full force. Maybe it is, he said, shrugging. But people wonder, did you really think you could marry into one of the oldest institutions in the world, shake up centuries of tradition, and not ruffle feathers? Or was ruffling feathers the whole point? The question hit like a blade. Meghan's practiced smile cracked for a split second. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs tightly, her hands clasped on her lap. I didn't marry Harry to ruffle feathers, she said, her voice slightly sharper. I married him because I love him. I think even you can understand that. The crowd chuckled nervously, sensing the tension thickening. Bill tilted his head, the smirk never leaving. Oh, I get it. But love's funny, isn't it? Because somehow love came with Netflix specials, book deals, and endless interviews about how awful palace life was. Do you think maybe, just maybe, you traded one kind of royalty for another kind of branding? A faint flush crept up Meghan's cheeks. Her lips pressed together before she answered. That's a remarkably cynical way to view marriage, Bill, she replied coolly. But I suppose cynicism is your brand. The audience gasped softly, some cheering for her quick comeback. Bill chuckled, but the grin didn't quite reach his eyes this time. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair, a lot of people think you knew exactly what you were doing when you left the family. That you wanted the freedom, the fame, and the cash, without the boring parts like duty, tradition, or accountability. What would you say to those people? Meghan's jaw tightened ever so slightly. I'd say they clearly don't understand what it's like to live in an environment that damages your mental health and isolates you completely. I made a choice to protect my family. I don't expect everyone to understand that, but I do expect people to respect it. Bill raised his brows. Mental health, yes, very popular these days. He let the words hang for a moment. But you can see how it looks, right? You left, criticized the family on global television, signed lucrative deals, and now you're sitting here telling your side of the story again. That's not just protecting your health. That's managing your image, which is fine. Just don't pretend it's some noble crusade. The audience murmured, gasps, a few uneasy laughs. Meghan's smile faltered completely now. Her eyes narrowed just slightly as she tilted her head. I think it says a lot, Bill, she said, her voice sugar-sweet but with an icy undertone, that you reduce my experiences to image management. But then again, you've built a career on cynicism, haven't you? The crowd reacted loudly this time, half gasping, half cheering. Bill simply leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, a glint in his eye. For the first time that night, civility was officially gone. The studio lights felt hotter now, as though the temperature in the room had risen along with the tension. Bill Maher's grin lingered, but it was sharper, more predatory, as he leaned slightly forward on the desk. See, Meghan, he said, tapping a finger on the table for emphasis. This is exactly why people don't buy the polished act. You give these long speeches about purpose and empowerment, but the second someone asks you a tough question, suddenly it's all about how unfairly you're treated. Meghan crossed her arms tightly, her smile frozen in place. Or maybe, Bill, I'm just tired of men like you twisting women's stories to make them fit your narrative. It's almost like you want me to play the victim so you can feel clever tearing me down. Bill raised an eyebrow. Oh, please. Don't flatter yourself. I love opinionated women. What I don't love is someone who cashes in on their personal drama and then pretends they're being silenced. The audience let out a low gasp. Meghan tilted her head, her lips curving into a sweet but clearly forced smile. Bill, you've made a career out of ridiculing people. So forgive me if I don't take life advice from a man who hides behind punchlines. Bill chuckled dryly. Oh, I'm not hiding, Meghan. I've been doing this for decades. Presidents, dictators, Hollywood elites, you name it. I've never had a problem asking tough questions. The difference is, most of them don't melt down the second things get uncomfortable. The crowd reacted, half gasps, half nervous laughter. Meghan's posture stiffened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. I'm not melting down, she said sharply. I'm standing up to condescension dressed up as journalism. Bill leaned back, clearly amused by the tension building between them. Funny, because from where I'm sitting, it looks a whole lot like a tantrum. There was an audible reaction from the audience this time. Gasps, some cheers, a few awkward laughs. Meghan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You know what, Bill? Maybe it's just easier for you to dismiss a woman as emotional rather than admit you're being disrespectful. Bill smirked, tilting his head slightly. No, Megan, I just think the Netflix version of events you keep selling doesn't hold up when you actually have to answer real questions. The crowd roared. Bandinesinabem roared, some in support of him, some clearly uncomfortable with how intense things had become. Megan's voice softened, but it was the kind of softness that felt rehearsed, like she was playing to the cameras. I came here to have a meaningful conversation about my work, not to be belittled by a man who thinks cheap shots pass for journalism. Bill's grin widened again, satisfied. Then maybe next time, Megan, you should try giving real answers instead of rehearsed sound bites. The tension was now electric. The audience could feel it. The interview was no longer a conversation. It was a duel, and the gloves were well and truly off. The room felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every time Bill spoke, the crowd reacted. Gasps, awkward laughter, occasional applause. Megan, sitting rigidly in her chair, looked like she was moments away from losing the perfectly polished composure she'd carried in with her. Bill leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes locked on her. You talk a lot about empowerment, Megan, about using your voice. But here's the thing. Empowerment doesn't mean immunity from tough questions. You wrote a book, signed massive deals, made documentaries airing every grievance imaginable. Don't you think people have the right to ask about that? Megan's smile was gone now, replaced with a cold, tight expression. Bill, you're not asking questions. You're trying to humiliate me. There's a difference. Bill tilted his head, smirking. No, Megan, I'm holding you accountable. That's what this is. And maybe that's the real problem. You've built a brand on playing the victim. But the second someone refuses to play along, suddenly it's an attack. The audience reacted loudly, some gasps, some applause. Megan leaned slightly forward, her tone dropping into icy sweetness. Accountability? Coming from a man who spent decades ridiculing people for entertainment? That's rich. Bill chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Oh, I ridicule people, sure, but at least I'm honest about it. You, on the other hand, built an empire on grievance and somehow convinced yourself that makes you brave. Megan inhaled sharply, her nostrils flaring. You have no idea what I've been through. What it's like to be hunted by the press, betrayed by your own family, judged for every single thing you say or do. Bill cut her off, his voice suddenly louder, sharper. Oh, spare me, Megan. Millions of people struggle every day without multi-million-dollar Netflix contracts to cushion the blow. You wanted fame without accountability, privilege without responsibility. And tonight you can't hide behind your rehearsed speeches. The studio went dead silent. Even Megan's practiced PR smile couldn't hide the fury in her eyes now. You're unbelievable, she said through clenched teeth. This is exactly the kind of bullying I've been talking about for years. And you're proving every bit of it right now. Bill slammed his hand lightly on the desk, the smirk gone completely. Enough. I've hosted this show for over 20 years, Megan. I've dealt with presidents, world leaders, the toughest people in the world. But I've never had a guest so unwilling to actually have a conversation. The crowd gasped again. Megan's hands clenched tightly on her lap, her jaw set in a hard line. Bill straightened, his voice cold and final. We're done here. For a moment, neither of them moved. The camera zoomed in, catching every micro-expression. The tension, the anger, the sheer disbelief radiating from Megan. The audience knew this wasn't just another interview. This was about to become television history. The studio felt like it had stopped breathing. The overhead lights glared down, hot and unforgiving, as Megan stood rigidly in her chair. Her jaw was tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. You're kicking me out, she said finally, her voice sharp with disbelief. Bill didn't flinch. Yes, I've never done this in over 2 decades of hosting, but tonight I'm making an exception. You didn't come here for a conversation, Megan. You came here for a monologue, and that's not what this show is. The audience collectively gasped, a mixture of shock and fascination. Cameras zoomed in on Megan's face, catching every flicker of emotion. The rage, the disbelief, and the dawning realization that she was losing control of the narrative. Megan let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head slowly. This is pathetic. You're proving exactly the point I've been making for years about how women get treated when they refuse to smile and nod. You can't handle a woman who won't play along with your smug little game. Bill's expression hardened. Spin it however you want, Meghan, but the truth is you've made a career out of telling your story on your terms, without ever facing real questions. Tonight, for once, you couldn't dodge them, and you didn't like it. You think this is accountability? Meghan snapped, her voice rising slightly. This is bullying. This is what happens when a man can't stand a woman who owns her voice. You call it journalism. I call it cruelty. You can call it whatever makes you feel better, Bill countered coolly. But accountability isn't cruelty. It's asking the questions that need to be asked, especially of someone who's profited so heavily from their own narrative. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be here. The tension in the room was suffocating. Even the audience didn't know how to react. Some sat frozen, others exchanged nervous glances, a few whispered to each other. Meghan's practiced composure finally cracked. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound echoing through the studio. With deliberate precision, she ripped off her mic pack, the wire snapping loose, and slammed it onto the desk with a loud clack. "You know what, Bill?" she said, her voice sharp and cold. "You don't deserve my words. Congratulations. This is your big viral moment. Enjoy it." Gasps rippled through the audience. Meghan turned sharply, her heels striking the stage floor like gunshots. Each step she took toward the backstage exit was deliberate, controlled. Yet everything about her body language screamed fury. Bill watched her go, arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable. At the edge of the swayam, Meghan paused. She turned back toward the audience, her chin lifted high, her eyes blazing. "This," she said loudly, her voice unwavering, "is what happens when a woman refuses to sit quietly and be disrespected. They call it a meltdown. They call it unprofessional. But the truth is that some men just can't handle being challenged." The audience was silent, every eye locked on her. She let the moment hang for just a second longer before turning and walking away, her back straight, her every movement deliberate and defiant. The cameras lingered on her retreating figure until she disappeared into the wings. For a long moment, Bill simply stood at his desk, his hands resting flat against the surface, staring at the empty chair Meghan had just vacated. The room felt suspended in time. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. Finally, Bill exhaled, smoothed his tie, and looked directly into the camera. "To everyone watching at home," he began, his voice calm but firm. "This is what accountability looks like. It's not always pretty, it's not always polite, but it's real. And if you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't write the book, sign the deal, or take the interview in the first place." The audience erupted into uneasy applause, some cheering for Bill, others still in shock over what they had just seen. Bill raised a hand to quiet them. "I've hosted this show for over 20 years. I've had conversations with presidents, dictators, comedians, philosophers, people from every walk of life. We can disagree, we can debate, we can argue. But there's a line, and tonight, that line was crossed." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "This show is about real conversation. It's not about rehearsed talking points. It's not about PR strategies. It's about facing the tough stuff and answering honestly. If you can't do that, this isn't the place for you." His eyes stayed fixed on the camera, the smirk gone, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. Meghan Markle chose to leave, and that's fine. She has every right to walk away. But so do we. And tonight, we chose not to let this turn into a performance disguised as a conversation. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Bill finally gave a faint smile, the faint trace of his usual humor returning. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice steady, "with an actual conversation." The screen faded to black. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of Meghan storming off the set spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended worldwide. Maher vs. Meghan, #Royal Meltdown, Accountability TV. Pundits were already debating who had been in the wrong. Was Bill too harsh? Or had Meghan finally been confronted with the scrutiny she'd spent years avoiding? But one thing was certain. This wasn't just another late-night interview. It was the night Bill Maher did what no one else had done: kick Meghan Markle off live television. And everyone knew it would be remembered for years to come.